So our special guest for this conversation is Duluth Mayor Emily Larson. I'm going to read your bio now.
Don't. Okay.
Just a
Do what you have to do. I know you have a job.
Just real quick. Okay.
Yeah.
Mayor Larson was elected in November 2015, re-elected in November 2019. Prior to becoming mayor, she was president of the Duluth City Council, served as commissioner on the Duluth Economic Development Authority, and was a city council conduit to parks and libraries. Her priorities include addressing economic, racial, and opportunity disparities citywide. This is good because it's relevant to our conversation today.
Good.
Advancing energy efficiency and climate resilience, increasing and improving the city's affordable housing stock, ensuring every resident has access to reliable, high-speed broadband internet, and continuing to grow Duluth's robust and unique economy. So please join me in welcoming Mayor Emily Larson.
Thank you.
And this will be fun. I'm mainly going to be asking you questions. However, I have done some reporting on this issue, and I hosted a talk show on this issue about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. So I have some things I think I can share to the conversation.
Yeah, and I just want to say this is fun for us, Dan, because we live in the same city. Duluth is a big small town. Our kids know each other. We don't actually get to hang out very much because our jobs require a lot of professionalism.
So we're going to hang out.
Professionalism.
In front of you all now.
Yeah, so this is actually really fun for you and I. Yeah, thank you.
But I want to start, Mayor, because this whole issue of climate migration, it's interesting for me. So I moved to Duluth 11 years ago from Flagstaff, Arizona, and a friend of mine back in Arizona at the time, I haven't told you this, but when I told him I was moving to Duluth, he said, "Oh, you're getting ahead of climate change." And I kind of laughed it off and didn't think about it until this issue came up in Duluth a few years ago. And I'm like, wow, my friend was a lot smarter and more prescient than I was.
You should keep asking that friend what you should do next.
I know, right? And then it came up on my radar screen again a few years ago when a researcher from Harvard named Jesse Keenan identified Duluth as a climate migration hotspot. And he actually came to Duluth to do a conference about it. But I want to ask you, is that when it first came on your radar screen?
Yeah.
Or did you know about it before then?
No.
You heard about it?
Thank you. I'm so glad we're doing this. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to the Great Northern. Thank you to my family and friends, who are most of you here today. And it's so great to see you. I got college roommates. I got my parents. So thank you.
I have nobody.
Dan, we're all one people. So anyway, thank you. It's good to be here. And yes, so the first time I really was oriented to climate migration was exactly then. So Dr. Jesse Keenan, Harvard professor, researcher, doing a lot of work in this space, a very high profile series of articles in the New York Times about his research in identifying where people were going to be moving. That was the very first exposure I had to it. And when the New York Times came to town and Dr. Jesse Keenan came to town, we did do a series of meetings and presentations on the topic. And what was interesting is he had done research apart from Duluth, but then came to Duluth for probably 5 or 6 days and did some of his own kind of research on it. That was my first experience with it. And there's so many places we can go with it, and I don't want to get ahead of how you want to lead the conversation. So where do you want to start?
I'm curious, what did you make of it? I mean,
I thought it was terrifying.
Well, how so?
I thought it was terrifying. I still do. I felt two things viscerally. The first was tremendous sadness. I felt and continue to feel so sad that we know there are impacts on our environment and our climate and our water and the air we breathe based on decisions we are making, based on policies we are making, based on investments we are choosing to not make that could make things better, to the point that people have to undo generations of where they've lived and pick up and plant themselves somewhere different. That's terribly sad to me. People don't do that lightly. So that was the first thing. And then really scared. I mean, it just feels like, and I do know Representative Larry Kraft is here, and Larry's been a good friend and one of the leaders in the State House for 100% by 2040. So thank you, Representative. So we are seeing good progress, and a lot of those important things are happening, but it also felt really terrifying. Like here, for me as a mayor, it feels like we're still putting our oxygen masks on. We're not ready to kind of help the passenger next to us, and yet the climate is calling us to do that. And so it's a lot.
When I first heard about his research,
What did you think? We'll turn the tables.
You know, I mean, I think it was probably like one of those winter days when it was like 0 degrees. I'm like, really? People are going to
Yeah.
move
Yeah,
to
yeah.
Duluth because of climate. I mean, Duluth is an awesome city. It's not for everybody. The winters are a real deal. It's a real thing. I mean, so my first reaction was kind of skepticism.
Yeah.
But, and we'll get into this, it's a thing though. There are a lot of people, because I've interviewed many of them, and I know you've talked to them, who are moving to Duluth because of climate change reasons. But I want to, the title of this talk is about Duluth as a climate refuge city.
Yeah.
Because Jesse Keenan makes a distinction, I think it's an important one we should talk about, because folks who are moving to, I mean, climate migration is a huge and serious issue and a sad issue, as you talked about. I mean, it's potentially going to displace millions and millions of people. It already is starting to displace people. The folks we're talking about here are not people who have like lost their homes in a hurricane. There's a distinction with people who have
There's some choice.
who have the means and who are climate aware.
That's right.
And maybe are experiencing wildfires out west, and they have the means and the ability to look somewhere else to move.
Yeah.
And I want to make that distinction. I mean, does that jive with you? I mean,
Totally. I actually had very different assumptions. Well, yes and no. So that is very true. I would say, and actually this is interesting. So the New York Times was back in town this week to do another series of articles that will come out at some point on this topic.
they're here already. I heard
They were here this past week.
okay.
And they were talking about, well, how are you actually tracking the number of people who are moving here? And we actually aren't. We don't have a scientific way to do that. And one of my pitches to them was, to work with them if they want to work with us, to try to help us track how some of that is happening. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence around, the housing prices, the housing market, all sorts of things that are coming up like that. But I will say I made a very big assumption that turned out really just to be my own bias when I was first hearing about this, that people who would move to Duluth would be these very high-end, kind of crunchy granola, can move anywhere people. And in many cases, there is some of that is very true. What I have also found, however, is very deeply hardworking blue-collar people looking for, who both have 2-year, 4-year, no college degrees. This is not necessarily retirees with millions of dollars that can really up and relocate. This is really, in many cases, also people who have yet to start a family building journey, and they want a safe, secure place where they can do that, and they're not going to have to pick up and move in 15 years. These are people who can work remotely, as many of us can now, and are choosing a quality of life that for them matches what we offer in Duluth. So yes, there's a lot that kind of gets mixed up in that. What I will say that's been really wonderful about, and I meet people probably once a week who have moved to Duluth for climate reasons.
Really?
And they are saying things like someone who works in our office, one of our admin assistants, doesn't fit any conventional bill that you would kind of place at the front end of what this person might be like, sound like, look like, and all the bias we might have around that. Moved because of wildfires and air control in California. Someone else I know moved from California because they couldn't get to pick up their kids in time during a wildfire emergency because the highways were closed. Wow. We know people who are moving. So I am meeting mostly people from California and Colorado. A lot of it is fire related, some other coastal regions around flooding. But it is literally like it is a terrifying feeling to not know how you get through each day based on these big climate and weather emergencies. And so the last thing I'll say to this question that's been really wonderful is that people who have chosen Duluth, they've gone way out of their way. They've done the research. They are extraordinary residents. They are volunteering. They are giving money to nonprofits. They show up to public meetings on public works things. Like they are in. They have done the research. They have chosen Duluth. And they have tremendous pride about that, and they are just wonderful advocates and partners in the community. But the face and brand of who you think they are doesn't necessarily match who they are, because in the end, we all need some of the very same things, which is a safe, stable environment to live. I will say that distinction between migration and refugee is real. We do have many people in our community who don't have financial means to make choices on where they're going to live, and that's a very different conversation.
Yeah, and I want to get to that piece for sure. I'm curious. I mean, I interviewed maybe a dozen folks when I did my stories on this who had moved, and also a lot of folks from the West. I mean, most people cited wildfires.
Yeah.
And wildfire smoke and repeated wildfire smoke over multiple seasons as their reason for moving. However, I wanted to ask you, because for everyone I talked to, climate was a reason, but it wasn't the sole reason. And the housing costs came up a lot with folks I talked to who cited Duluth's relative affordability with housing. When you talk to folks, do you hear that as well, or are you hearing more strictly climate?
Yeah, well, that's quality of life, right? So I will just, a quick plug for Duluth is, we're just 2.5 hours up the shore.
Easy drive.
Easy drive. NLX will be coming through. It'll make it easier for you. But we are 25 miles long. Every inch of that is on water. We are on the St. Louis River or Lake Superior. 42 creeks that run down a hill. 37% of our land is parkland. That's wonderful. I think that's a tremendous asset, quality of life asset. It's challenging because it means we don't have some of the density and some of the opportunity for development that many other communities do. But we have hundreds of miles of trails, and your commute to work is like literally 4 minutes. So the quality of life is really tremendous in Duluth. And so I do think people choose that. There's also a very real, authentic, easy ethic about people who are Duluthians. We work really hard. We're fiercely loyal to each other. You can call almost anyone in this community in the middle of the night to come fix your car, and they'll show up. That's the kind of community Duluth is. And so I do think people feel that. And we're not very pretentious. We're not very fancy. We just show up as we show up. And I think people like that too. But yes, the price of housing is something I've heard a lot about from people who are paying, a lot more in other places.
Well, they have equity in some of these folks who I've talked to,
That's right.
are cashing out equity in homes out west. And
that's right.
Finding they can get quite a bit of house in Duluth.
And they're finding, we will tell, and again, anecdotally, this is why it would be really interesting to partner, whether it's the New York Times or UMD School of Economics, on how are we actually capturing growth. We have seen for the first time, I think since 1980, we actually did have growth in our census. And I remember you were at that press conference where we talked about that, Dan, and I think you were like, but really, is that so much growth we should be celebrating it? And I was like, yeah, it kind of is, Dan, because we haven't grown for like 40 years.
Right. And I want to, Duluth's population has been, and the reason I was interested in that, Mayor, is because, there's been so much positive press about Duluth, and, Outside Magazine called it the best outdoors town in the world. And there's just been a lot of positive energy with a lot of the trail development. And you hear about people wanting to move to Duluth. So it's always been surprising to me that the population hasn't grown more than it has. Right. And that's why I was interested in exploring that.
Yeah.
Which leads me to this question. And when Jesse Keenan came, he came up with those little slogans like climate proof Duluth, like actually as a way of like thinking that Duluth could market itself as like a climate refuge city, like this title of this talk is called. And actually Buffalo, New York has done some of that.
Yes.
Which is fascinating to me, and I wonder if they're rethinking that in the wake of.
I wondered that
because
too.
There's a climate link to
to
all the lake effect snow they've gotten, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
But I digress. But I wonder. Could this be a good thing, or is this a good thing that folks are wanting to move to Duluth? Because there's lots of access to water. There's a moderate climate. There's a lot of these other benefits you talked about. Is it something that you thought of? Should Duluth be marketing itself?
Well, it is. So a couple of things. First, you called me mayor, and that's so nice, but I would prefer Emily. So thank you. In the other places, we can do that, Mr. Crocker, but I would prefer Emily. Okay. There's that. Then, so Jesse Keenan, yes, I will say he is not a marketer, and he is a very smart, actually super kind person, doing really good work, continues to do good work. So he did come up with kind of some of these things. In his mind, this would be a great way to grow Duluth. And I will say Duluth is 87 now, 1,000 residents.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But we are a built environment that actually has the capacity for about 125 or 130,000 because of how we have grown, because we are this landmass like this that has incorporated over time. We have a whole road and infrastructure development that actually, if we build density up, we actually already have the water lines, the streets. All of that is actually already very built. We have a lot of roads. I guess mine is kind of one of them where you feel like you're in the middle of the country when you're in the middle of the city. And my whole front row, thank you, family,
She
nodding
lives
their
on a
heads.
dirt road.
Dirt road in the middle of the city. So there's a lot of those kinds of things in Duluth. And so we do actually have the capacity. What I remember about that particular part of the conversation, I think we were at UMD in the theater kind of talking when he was bringing that up. And Karen Diver, who at the time was either still the chairperson at Fond du Lac, with the Fond du Lac Band and the Fond du Lac Sovereign Nation, which is our nearest tribal government in proximity with us in the city of Duluth. She was either still chairperson or just recently maybe had moved on to the Obama administration, but she very much rankled at this notion. And I appreciated her willingness to be really bold and clear in calling out, you know, when we're talking about land, we're talking about a lot of really complicated things. Who gets to own it and market it? Who gets to make the decisions? Who gets to benefit? Whose story is it? Whose future is it? So this notion that we're just out there casually saying we've got land historically has not worked for everybody. And so for me, there is that balance of cultural awareness, historical trauma. You know, we obviously, I think this room is likely filled with people who understand redlining and all sorts of intentionality around who gets to access space and place. And so this notion that for me, it feels predatory to, well, just, I don't know, I'll just be really candid in this whole talk, but it just feels really predatory to say to people, I'm really sorry that we're messing up the climate in your city, but you can come here.
Because it's cooler by the lake.
It's cooler by the lake. I thought you were maybe going to want to talk about snow plowing when you brought up, but I'm glad we won't. But I will, it's always too soon.
Right.
But I
People
will
complain about snow plowing, in case you're wondering what the reference was.
Yeah. But I will also just say, so I did go on and look at Buffalo, New York. They have a beautiful website. They have clearly invested in telling their story about why they want you to live there and move there and how I mean, so it isn't just, it's not, I did not find their information kind of, you know, cutesy or plythy or whatever. I actually found it really intentional, smart, very well designed, really exciting. And also, that's just not the strategy we're going to choose to use. That is not who we are. And I don't mean that we're not a community that evolves and changes. We're working really hard on our core values and showing up in ways that are meaningful for our community. But that would be very much out of step with who we are for us to invest in this marketing strategy around that.
Specifically around Duluth as a climate refuge.
Yes. Maybe that will happen in the future, but that does, I feel like, I mean, don't you have a pulse on us, Dan? And I just feel like that's not how, that wouldn't go well.
But let me
Yeah, go.
Let me change the question and
Yeah.
ask it this way. Because the folks I've talked to are attracted to the things about Duluth that your administration and Don Ness's administration have worked hard at promoting and
Yeah.
improving, I think.
Yeah.
Because people are really attracted to Duluth's outdoor recreation.
Yep.
The last two administrations have put a lot of resources into that. You know, the city has outwardly turned towards the lake and embraced the lake and built a sustainable lake walk and invested a lot in that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people who are moving here are moving to Duluth are moving for.
Yeah.
You want those folks, right?
Totally. And also, yes, absolutely. And also, there are many people who we can't leave behind.
Right.
And so maybe what I'm actually saying is we can't do one without the other. And we're still really formulating how we are building a community that works for everybody. And I think lots of communities are doing that, right? So I think the tension isn't that we don't want to bring new people in. I think the tension for me is that there are people with deep needs that we need to be investing strategies there as well.
Let me follow up on that because I didn't realize this until I was just prepping for this, but UMD did a little work looking in the wake of Jesse Keenan's work and a lot of the media attention. And it was, I think, through the business research school, and they interviewed some people about this notion and what they think about Duluth as a climate migration hub. And one of the responses they got was this idea of equity. Yeah. And you know, and I'm paraphrasing what this response was, but basically that the city's already struggling to meet the needs of everyone in the community. You know, there's, as you know, there's housing disparities and income disparities and health disparities. And it's a sense that we shouldn't add to the city's population until we can care for everyone. I mean, is that kind of what you're speaking to?
I think that is. I mean, and it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's also, that could be the status. It's complicated. There's a lot to pay attention to in this. And I think maybe that's part of, for me, what the whole topic that we get to talk about today and think about and challenge ourselves is, it's really complicated. These questions we are struggling with now about being, whether we're a climate refuge or climate migration, whether we are struggling, you know, to just get ahead in different things. These are costly problems. These are problems that cities and communities and counties right now have to do on their own, because we haven't, up until recently, had state or federal framework that really is not just stabilizing, but aspirational and visionary. And you can't run a city on a project-by-project basis. You have to run it with a sense of vision and an arc of where you're going. And so right now we're seeing opportunities, whether it is in the Inflation Reduction Act or other pieces of legislation that are coming out, real investment that will help democratize the things that have to happen for communities to function, and to catch up to the climate crisis in ways that can ensure that they have water and power. Like for us, we still have real climate problems. We have an abundance of water, and I think that's the big question. Like in Arizona, Scottsdale, which I know is not Flagstaff, but you know, those kinds of things. We actually have an abundance of water, but we also have above ground utilities and hurricane force winds. We have waves and water that flood infrastructure, and people can't get to their neighborhoods because the roads are totally washed out. I mean, we have significant climate issues. They aren't totally manageable, to be honest, but they're not, and they do feel out of control at times, but they are not the kinds of daily trauma that many people are experiencing in other places.
But I think that's an important point to raise, is that it's because a couple of years ago when I was doing some of these stories on this issue was the year that we had all that wildfire smoke from, I think, from the Greenwood fire and also from the fires up in Canada. It came all the way down here, if I recall, and really poor. And a guy I talked to said he was actually having, like, you know, it was traumatic for him because it sort of brought him back to California.
Exactly.
So I think I mean, Duluth is maybe more, I guess, the impacts may be more moderate than other places, but clearly still impacts from climate change. Back to the piece about, are there things that the city could be doing, or you are doing? And maybe this will get a little wonky, but I know you like. I know you like policy details. I mean, are there things that the city should or could be doing to prepare for an influx? Because I know it's not. I mean, it's a lot of the evidence right now is anecdotal. I know that I don't think the city's not tracking climate migrants, right?
Correct.
But everyone I talk to says it's a thing, and we know it's happening. If climate change proceeds at the pace it's proceeding, it's going to happen more. I mean, should the city be doing things to get ready?
Yeah, so here's what we are doing. It's great, and I will try not to get too wonky, but we can talk after. So yes, there are a variety of things that we think about. So we have documents like the Comprehensive Plan, the Unified Development Code, all sorts of things that really guide a city. They guide where you're going to invest. What is your strategy for public transportation? How are you going to place density and housing in neighborhoods? These are really important documents, and wherever you live, these are the things that will guide the decision makers of your communities. And so it's important to know that those documents exist. So what we think about is, how are we connecting people to the resources and economic development strategies that increase food and access, that increase housing units, both in affordability and just the actual number of housing units that we need to have. We are doing internal policy shifting. I hired and created a sustainability office and a sustainability officer, which at the time was moderately controversial. I will say, in the city of Duluth, we have already, for the most part, we can always find people who will not agree with this statement, but in the city of Duluth, we have already decided and determined that climate change is real, for the most part, right? That's been my experience, and this is one of the one of the issues of most urgent action from our residents. So we created this office, created a work plan around that. This one person, I have one sustainability officer, she just brought in $33 million of investments into climate adaptation and climate resilience into the city of Duluth just last year. So we are doing a lot around how are we looking at our own infrastructure. Since 2016, the city of Duluth has decreased our greenhouse gases 32%. We own 2 utilities. So there's a lot that we're constantly thinking about. When I first came into office, we have a steam utility downtown. We have transformed it into district energy, but it was once a coal-fired steam plant that would pull in millions and millions of gallons of water cold from Lake Superior, heat it with coal, send it through a steam system through downtown, and then discharge hot water back into the lake. Everything about that is a terrible, terrible environmental system. So because the state chose to invest in us, we now have a closed loop hot water system that is powered primarily not on coal. And so, there's a lot of big wins that we're working on there. But one of the other thing that we are doing, for instance, is like water pumping. Water's critically important. How people get their water. We have had storms and power go out in the city of Duluth where we haven't had the redundancy that I want. We have come very close to neighborhoods not having water for days at a time, and that is terrifying and unacceptable. So how are we building in power grid and redundancy into that? And then my biggest dream, actually, we spend millions of dollars a year just pumping water, out of the lake, up the hill, to communities. You're finding places like Scottsdale that had to turn off water to one of the neighboring municipalities because they didn't have enough to share or spread out. We are trying to make sure that never happens, but also to build in energy resilience so that as we're pumping water, we're not just doing that using natural gas fueled power, that we're actually using solar to do that. And so we just got $1 million grant to really plan and experiment with that. So we are really, I'm proud of the work we're doing in this arena. It's partly because we as a community prioritized it. It's partly because we just kind of pushed through resistance. But I would say it's mostly because we invested in the policies and the staff that made it a priority.
Can you talk about the housing piece a little bit more? I think that's a big part of this. Because I know part of the, and you referenced this earlier, Duluth, the population was once what, 115,000?
I can't remember how high it got. It was over 100 at one point.
Right. So I know part of what Jesse Keenan was arguing, and I think a lot of the Rust Belt,
yeah,
we could broaden this conversation out as well, because I think the Great Lakes region has been identified as a potential climate change refuge, and partly because these cities have been hollowed out to an extent, and there is room for new folks to come in.
Yep.
And there's existing infrastructure like you talked about. But I know I've talked to some of your housing folks before, and the housing patterns have changed, right? The households are smaller. But I know you're doing some progressive things in terms of zoning and allowing tiny homes and back in granny flats. So talk a little bit about.
I've never heard granny flats, but I love it.
Heard granny flats?
No, it's so great.
It's a thing.
Yeah.
But talk about how assuming that more migrants come. And even if it's not climate migrants, you want to grow, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And let's also make sure that this community will work for people who don't have an abundance of financial means, right? To voluntarily relocate to a high-end home, right? So that's also our call and our responsibility. So a couple of things. One, I do think the Great Lakes, this conversation can expand, and there are really important communities across the Great Lakes doing good work. The Great Lakes is also one of the very, very rare bipartisan, multi-partisan events on the federal government. There is very little arguing around how to fund communities around the Great Lakes. There's politics about that, but the Great Lakes themselves are binational and bipartisan. And so I do think that that's to everyone's benefit too. And there's a lot of compacts around how the water is used and who gets to make decisions about that. Yes, for housing, we have chosen to do, because we are landlocked, we can't get a developer to build 150 brand new homes in a scalable, affordable way, because we just don't have that land mass. That's our benefit, but we just don't have that. So we have to be very creative. We did a program called Rebuild Duluth, where we were actually giving away free land to proposals, and this could be a developer or it could be, the Crocker family coming forward with an affordable housing unit for that site. We would give you the land for free. It was a competition, and it actually went great. It's been really exciting to see that happen. We did change accessory dwelling units. You can create an apartment in your garage. You can add a tiny home. We have also invested. So we took $19 million of the ARP, American Rescue Plan funds, put that directly only into affordability. So we were able to bring about 400 new units of affordable housing online, which is a really big number for the city of Duluth. And then we also just launched a housing trust fund with Duluth LISC. LISC is a national nonprofit. They are bringing money. We are matching money. We have $16 million. And what we're really trying to do here is to accelerate the pace of housing development, because we want to increase the number of units so we can drive down the overall competitive rental and sales rate. We want to change the kind of units we have. We don't have enough townhomes. We don't have nearly enough senior housing. And it's one of the biggest things I hear is that people want to live and stay in the city they love, the neighborhood they love, and there isn't an affordable senior housing place to go. So again, when we want to keep people moving and thriving, housing has to be a part of the climate discussion. It just has to be. And then how are we building those units? We will subsidize greater to meet energy efficiency goals. And then lastly, the thing that we require, I don't know other cities in the state of Minnesota that do this, but we do require very specific job creation goals and workforce development hiring goals when you get public dollars to build projects. That's just been a part of how I do business and how our work at the city does business. And so ensuring that as we're growing a development, we're also growing job opportunity in a really intentional way.
I apologize, I'm jumping around a little bit, but thank you for that. But I'm really interested in sort of the equity piece and this concern of folks who live in Duluth about these newcomers coming and maybe, taking away resources, or the focus should be on the folks who are here now, that sort of idea.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I referenced that research that UMD Business School did, where they did some interviews with folks. Another perspective that was brought forth was that Duluth is to some degree an insular town, not a very diverse town.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that there can be a lot of benefit from folks from out west, from the southeast, coming to Duluth and bringing new ideas, new energy.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that.
Well, this is why I felt like I was trying to be careful when I talked about it earlier, because there is also that we are still a very white community. And so how are we changing our identity in the face of community? I think part of what I was hoping to get to earlier in my comments, and maybe I didn't fully get there, is that we are still, it feels like the political and social intersection we are at as people right now is one of scarcity. We are not at this thinking of abundance, that the more for your family, Dan, the better that is for my family.
The fear that if more people come, they're going to lose.
Right.
Instead of adding to
correct. And changing that mindset doesn't happen just because you and I tell people that should happen. So it's how do we build in the thought of abundance as we're doing that, because we have to bring people along with us. There is no question that when people choose Duluth, they're great residents and they stick with us and we stick with them. There's no question that when people see, so part of the work that we've been doing as we've been growing both our government and how we show up for people in community in a meaningful way is making sure that people are seeing themselves. So I will just say my very first, so you don't get an orientation when you're a mayor. You just you have this really weird, very long job interview that's super public. People vote whether you get it, and then you just start the job. Super weird. And how it goes, and it's great. But so you just get sworn in and then you start working. So my very first day, I walk into the leadership team, and this is not, I don't want to offend anybody, and I want to be careful how I say this, and also I could walk into a lot of rooms. Most of the rooms I walked into my first few days, I literally just could have started by saying, gentlemen. I just could have. And good people, wonderful people, working hard in all sectors, and still. And so part of it that we have worked hard in is how are we showing up for community in a meaningful way? Who shows up matters. How the language is used matters. making sure that people who are Black and brown and indigenous, people of color, people who are GLBTQAI2S, that people see themselves in the community that they live, that they see themselves in the people that are working for them and with them. And so I think as we're growing, what I'm really proud of is that these values of climate sustainability, equity, we have worked so hard the past 7 years to embed these into the city ethic and how the city does business, that whoever comes next, whether that's next year or 5 years from now, they have to literally undo it. They have to literally say, we're no longer about job creation for people who don't have a high school diploma. We are no longer about making sure that affordability is built into every housing project that we do. You know what I mean? So some of the conversation of how we grow, I think we're still showing up for community. And so I don't know. I mean, it is hard. Like, you were a newcomer once.
I was. I mean, it's, I think, so I moved to Duluth when your predecessor, when Don Ness was in office, and him and I talked a lot about. He would talk about, and I feel like this is almost like the trajectory that Duluth has been on. He would talk about how when he came into office, a lot of the focus is on changing the narrative in Duluth and really like making people proud of their city again. Mm-hmm. Because back in the 80s and 90s, there was the infamous sign, like, the last person to leave Duluth, turn off the lights. I don't know, was that true?
It's totally true.
Is it? Okay.
I'm so glad it came up today. It comes up.
Because I always wonder if that's like an urban legend.
No, it's there.
And I think that narrative has changed.
Yeah.
But I think now this next step is like welcoming, like this willingness to welcome and want folks to come and to share like in what Duluth has.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if Duluth is there yet.
Well, I think, new people who come to Duluth, they don't know that narrative. They don't see it.
That's true.
They don't get it. And I'll just tell a quick story. It's partly because I have 4 parents, 3 are living. They're all 3 in the front row. And you're awesome and beautiful. And I love having you here. But the first time that I discovered Duluth, it was on the train from St. Paul to Duluth. The passenger rail that was there was the 1980s. My mom and dad took us. And probably early 80s, late 70s, something like that. I was born in 73. At any rate, here's what I remember about that trip. I got to go on a train. We walked with our suitcases down Superior Street to the Holiday Inn that, by the way, has 2 pools, 2 swimming pools. We threw rocks in the lake. We got ice cream at Woolworth's downtown. I grew up in St. Paul, and that was my first trip to Duluth. It never left my soul. And when I was 17 and going to college, that's where I went. And 30-some years later, that's where I live. That's where my husband and I have raised our kids, where we chose to build a life. I didn't know then that billboard was up. I didn't know then that people were leaving in huge amounts sad. I didn't know that the industries were closing, that there was tension around logging and mining, that beautiful, important company towns, Morgan Park, were feeling desolation and isolated. You don't know that. What I felt was joy and hope. I saw what I thought was the ocean. We had ice cream in the middle of the day. These things. And that's what new people feel and see when they come to Duluth. They don't remember that was the story. And so it's important that we honor that story and we remind people that we've been there, because I do think that part of our story is a big part of what gives us our grounded resilience now and our patience for the growth that we're seeing.
And the folks who I've talked to who moved to Duluth from out west, I think a lot of people were surprised at at what a great town it was and how beautiful it was and what the outdoor recreation was like. Mm-hmm. Because people on the coast have a certain perception of the Midwest. Duluth equals Kansas equals Iowa in a lot of folks' minds.
You have to want to get to Duluth from other places, but it's worth it. And so what we tell people, this topic in particular is very interesting to outlets, to national media outlets. It's very common that people are in town to talk about it. And the only thing that I ask when they're covering us, and actually I think the Daily Show is going to be in town at some point. They want to do a piece, and we were talking about them.
The Daily Show?
The Daily Show. And I was saying the only way I am willing to help do this is if we're not your punchline.
Right.
Like, we are not here to be made fun of. We are not here to play. We are not here to be anybody's punchline. And so, and which they were great about, by the way.
Yeah.
They were totally great about that. And they understood that. They understood the humanity that's there. But we are interesting to other cities. And I think part of it is it's hard to get here. It's so beautiful. You actually can't believe it. And people are just very, very real. We don't have a lot of time for pretension, probably because it's like 0 degrees a lot. And you just don't have time.
I wonder how much of this is almost self-fulfilling in a way, like since that first Times piece came out, you know, and I did a few stories, and now it's like, and because I talked to folks who ended up moving here from Utah. Wildfire smoke again was
all the time, yeah.
And you know, they first started talking. I mean, what happened was they loved Utah, they moved there, but then they found that the reason they had moved there to be outside and hiking, and they weren't able to enjoy it because one of their kids had asthma and with the wildfire smoke. So they started to think about moving, and they started looking around, like where could we go? And as they just started doing research, Duluth started popping up as climate, when they would look at climate and moving and now there's been so many stories.
Yeah.
And I heard that the Times is coming back because the head of the Realtors Association, who's a friend of mine who I've talked to a few times, after I interviewed her for my first story, she's like, I've talked to the Reuters, I've talked to BBC, the Times has called me. I mean, so I wonder how much this is, and that's why
I also think we're a storytelling community.
Yeah.
So we also are, you know, we haven't even hit on the creative arts, which is a huge economic driver in the city of Duluth.
People are attracted to that
it's
too.
Very creative. We have a ballet, we have an opera company, we have a week-long music, rock festival. I mean, it's the depth of art and, you know, expression we have, and they're just your neighbor. It turns out my next door neighbor's an opera singer. I didn't even know it, right? For like 10 years, I didn't even know it. That just happens all the time. And so I do think we're a storytelling community, though, and I think that's part of what people are hitting on when they come to us. But I also think there's a visceral, you get that Thompson Hill moment where you come over the hill and you come down the lake and you come down the highway and you see the lake, and it's really beautiful. And in my experience when I travel, which isn't actually a ton because I'm a homebody, and well, I'm a homebody. And so I don't do a ton of traveling, but when I do for work, it's like tell people where you're from. I never have to tell people where it is. I never have to say to everyone, it's about 2.5 hours. You know, people, they tell me where I'm from. That's what's interesting. They will be like, oh, no. I go there we go through there every year for the Boundary Waters. One year we went because my grandma grew up there. My kid went to college there. That's the first place. In fact, I saw that baby downstairs in the green room, and I was saying, come dip her toes in the lake, because so many people have said that's the first body of water I put my baby's toes in. Like, it's a story. It's not, oh, I've heard of it, I've driven by it. Oh, is that, you know, where boom, boom, boom is? It's people tell you their story. And so I think that's actually one of the other reasons why Duluth has this hook for people, because when you bring it up or you Google it, what you get is a story. Yeah.
I'm wondering if folks have questions for Emily Larson.
Or Dan Crocker.
And we do this gentleman over here, I think, and then we'll go to you second.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Andrew, born in Duluth, graduate of St. Scholastica. I work locally in housing justice, renters' rights. Here in Minneapolis, yeah. We have some of the worst racial disparities in housing here in Minneapolis. We have ever-growing homeless encampments that are facing increased brutality from our own mayor. I kind of want to talk about or ask about the predatory corporate finance area, which I think is a driver of climate change. And also here in Minneapolis, we have landlords that are owned by BlackRock, Zillow, Pretium. These are sort of like the financial forces that have seen Minneapolis as a place that'll pop. I think increasingly, whether it's the big ones or mid ones, are looking at Duluth, are looking at around the lakes. And you have organizations like the realtors organization that fight against common sense things like rent control. You can't build your way out of racism in housing. No place has ever done that. What sort of protections are there for, I looked up the 40% of Duluth people who are locked out of owning anything, have no property whatsoever, as not necessarily from a scarcity mindset, but what is available for them long term in their families?
Well, first of all, thank you for the work you do.
Yeah.
It's really important that people know that there are people in their corner. So thank you for that. And my background is actually in social work, and for 12 years I worked at CHUM. I don't know if you know CHUM, the nonprofit organization. So I worked in housing and shelter, and so that's important work, and it's really hard. So thank you. So a couple of things. So Duluth is a much smaller community in terms of, we were just talking about this actually, and maybe you remember this, it can feel uncomfortable at times, but it's also one of the most beautiful things, which is that we're small enough that you kind of know each other. People kind of know each other. That means it can be a hard network to tap into, but it also means that when we work hard to get to know a new person, we can bring them in and bring them up. We are not seeing some of the predatory things that you're describing, and you may have other facts to share with me later, and that would be actually helpful for me to hear. But we are not seeing the influx of the larger corporate presence yet, I think for two reasons. One, we're pretty small. We don't have any vacancy right now. We don't have room to give for a big buyer to come in and do some of that. We also have very strict, from the policy perspective, good or bad, depending on who you are, we actually have limits on Airbnbs and short-term rentals. And so we have done a few things like that. We do have, you asked something else specifically, about land. I'm sorry, I was just thinking about the land trust. We have a program called One Roof, which is our Minnesota land trust. And so we do have, they have expanded significantly even during the pandemic, and actually found that land trust homeowners defaulted at a minuscule rate compared to non-land trust homeowners. So we know that that model works, and so that one has just expanded greatly. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I do feel like we are tracking this as best we can. We don't have a ton of space for people to just come in and do a big market adjustment like that. And we have some protections around how we're licensing those things, what you have to do to go through that. And then actually that short-term rental license, and we do have some flexibility. If you want to rent out your home for Grandma's Marathon weekend, you can do that. You don't have to get a license for that. But we monitor the licenses very carefully, and then a portion of your rental license fee is going into that Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So those are some of the cycle that we're choosing to use.
Let's go over to, we have a question here, and then we'll go to you next, okay?
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. I got to write my first paper of grad school at the Humphrey School, on this exact topic.
Oh my gosh.
Yes,
You
I'm
should
really
be up
stoked to
here
be
then.
here.
No, right?
No.
You could probably add a lot.
Yeah. But I did get the opportunity to talk to a lot of the folks that you've been mentioning, which is really fun. And I think the thing that is really curious for me is that obviously Superior is right over the border, and it has a lot of the same geographic features that make Duluth such a good climate refuge. And obviously there's different cultural values and just a different culture overall, different state government, lots of differences. But they do have more land that's open for development. So I'm just kind of curious of have you talked to the folks in Superior? Is there a united front on this, or?
That's really interesting. It's such a great question. I mean, in the whole regional planning aspect is fascinating. It's a great question.
It's interesting. We do work with the city of Superior all the time, and they do have really different opportunities and regulations and limitations too. But what's been really fun, so we have a couple of big local employers. Cirrus is one of them. They manufacture airplanes. They're homegrown, beautiful place, important industry, really strong employer. They need to grow exponentially, which is great. But what we did is convene with them around their housing needs, but not just us. So Superior was there, Proctor was there, Hermantown was there. For me, if we can get housing in those, I want every single person who wants to develop to do that in Duluth. That's, not in the world as we talked about smart growth, but, I would love to meet all of that housing need in Duluth. But if we can meet it, that's good for all of us, right? And I know that we just don't have the scalability to bring some of that online. So yes, with intention, some of that is happening. And then some of that's being convened by St. Louis County, who works with some of those other communities.
I think that regional planning piece, as this issue progresses, is going to be super
Totally.
important.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Kate. I grew up in Duluth.
Oh,
I still
see?
own the house that I grew up in,
Ah,
born 44 years ago. We're talking a lot about preserving and enhancing the natural beauty of the city. And the dark sky is one of those things that I've seen deteriorate at an alarming rate over the last few years. When I was growing up, I could see the Milky Way, the Northern Lights from our home. Now I can see a few stars. There is, to me, a large economic opportunity for Duluth in terms of dark sky tourism. We have friends who travel to Scandinavia to see the Northern Lights, and they could be seen in their full glory in Duluth. And what a unique and amazing opportunity that is for Duluth. There is a light trespass ordinance that, to my understanding, is not enforced. And I'm wondering what your vision is for the dark sky of Duluth.
okay, I love this, and I want to talk with you after for sure. So thank you. Did you want to jump in and say anything before?
Well, I mean, it's I don't know if you want to say a few
Go
words,
ahead.
but it'd be great
Go
if you maybe do you want to take
Yeah,
talk
I'll
about
take
this?
it quick. So thank you for bringing this up. I love this concept. We've worked with the mayor of Superior on this. And actually, I do think that the St. Louis River Corridor has been designated a dark sky space and a dark sky kind of area. So I don't know exactly what the language is on that, but I would be happy to get back to you on that. Lighting just kind of brings me back. I have had some real throwdowns with people about lighting, to be honest. And it is because we have people who strongly, how we light things and how people feel translates into whether or not they feel safe in a lot of neighborhoods. And so, again, it's complicated. There's a difference, as you likely know, and many people in this room say won't spend time about the brightness, the color, the wattage, all the things. And I already have butchered how we talk about that because it's well beyond my pay grade. We have had several public fights about this and many more private ones, quite frankly, about how we want to approach this, whether it's facing up, whether it's facing down, all of those things. And so we right now do have something in the books, and I'm just not prepared to answer this question fully, except to say my vision is that we are in step with the community in finding the right balance between how does lighting impact safety and what does lighting actually need to be, and what are the other elements of safety that go beyond lighting, whether that is knowing your neighbors, whether that is, having a sense of connectivity and what's happening, whether that's investing in 18-hour day in different neighborhoods and not just concentrated ones. So there's a lot of variables to that, but I will tell you, I actually need more voices to speak up on this. And I know there's a choir, but it needs to get a little bit louder for me. And so if I can talk with you after, that would actually be really helpful.
I think we had another question here.
Did you want to say more? Okay.
No, it's okay. Just because we're running a little tight on
Oh yeah,
time.
you got it.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your great Christmas movie, Merry Kiss Cam.
Oh my gosh, we didn't even talk about it. Yes. So
Holiday of our
corny,
Christmas.
so good. So corny, so good.
Online, I'm seeing a lot of things about investment opportunities in Duluth, and that people like us should right now buy a house, let someone else pay them a mortgage for 20 years, and then sell it for 5 times the price when all the climate refugees get up there. Yeah. You used the word predatory. How can I make that kind of investment without having a negative impact on the effect on all those nice people in the Irish hockey bar?
So you are seeing a lot online? Yeah.
Well, predatory has something to do with intent, correct? And if your intent is to come in and buy low and sell high and not have an experience and not live and not invest and not pay attention, I would argue there's some predatory intent around that. And that's okay. And maybe that's the math that works for somebody to do that, but it's still okay to name that is also intentionally blocking out investment and opportunity for others who could maybe benefit from that in the short term. I will say that we are about to bring 500 new units of housing online just in a 2-block radius of downtown. We're about to bring what I hope to be up to 1,000 new units of housing to the old new Central High School site. So we're about to greatly expand the housing market, and there may be opportunities to do so should you want to buy into something, to do so in a scale that maybe it's a condo or apartment unit versus a house. So, I mean, there's ways to kind of think about that and talk about that a little bit. But our housing, I mean, it's affordable-ish now for many people, not all people, and it will no longer be there. And so part of what we're trying to do is increase the units so that we can keep that price within reach. I mean, that's just my answer to it. I don't know if I have a fuller one, but I really appreciate that you started your question with Mary Kisscam, which was, I will just give it a quick plug. I think it's on Hulu, correct? Oh, I should really know that. It was filmed in Duluth. It's so Duluthy. It's super Duluthy. Everything's Duluthy in there. And that's part of the creative economy. We have a lot of films actually being filmed in Duluth right now for many reasons that are its own breakout session. But it's incredibly corny and super charming. And if you have been to Duluth even once, you will love how grounded it is in that community.
We have time for one more question, I think, if somebody... Oh, you're first there, sir. Right, wait for the mic to get to you.
Well, thank you for being here and sharing your vision with us. I know there's a plan called Duluth 2035.
Yeah, comprehensive plan.
Exactly. And there's one in Minneapolis 2040. Yep. Every city sets an aspirational goal for where they want to go. I'm curious, as you look at 2035, what does it take to accomplish all the goals in the plan? And as you look out 12 years to 2035, what do you see as the gaps that need to be bridged?
Well, first of all, I am so excited to get a question about the comprehensive plan. So thank you, sir. Thank you, member of the audience, I should say, not identified
right
gender.
Year, too. That's impressive.
Oh, yeah, you knew the year. So we did, when I took office 7 years ago, we did review the comprehensive plan on 5 key qualities. I hope I can remember them offhand, because these were areas of tremendous growth and change since the previous comprehensive plan had been done. Transportation, open space, climate, housing, and economic development. Within those 5 categories, we actually infused 2 values, and they were fairness and health. When I first started talking, that those rooms I used to walk into and could have started by saying gentlemen, and we would do that differently now, also having different awareness about gender identity and how people would use language. But at that time, to walk into a room and say that, to talk with those rooms about fairness and health was an interesting challenge as well. And what we began doing is every policy, staff person, proposal, budget change anybody wants to make on our team, they have to make a case to me. They have to show me who did they talk to about this change or idea, how did they engage them, how did they talk to them, who have they potentially left out, whether on purpose or by mistake, and how is this going to fundamentally change and progress our community with greater fairness. Fairness being that people are getting what they need, not always in the same amounts. Different neighborhoods need different things. So I guess my answer to you is to say that because we are grounded in our values as a community, because when we're looking at economic development, we're also thinking about how is this going to impact health and fairness in our community. When we're looking at access to open space and green space, how are we making sure that we have fair and broad access and that we're increasing people's health? You know, we're getting there. We're getting there. We still got, 12 years to go on that comp plan. But I'm feeling grounded in it. I'm feeling like the work we're doing is still grounded in that because we so clearly worked with the community to make sure that it was their plan and not the city saying, this is where we're going. It was like, this is where we're going. So thank you.
We are out of time. Emily Larson, thank you.
Thank you, Dan Crocker.
And real quick, I just wanted to say that coming up next year at 5 o'clock, you can stick around to hear Jovan Speller and Gabriel Carter. They're going to be talking about cultural food preservation, climate limitations, and adaptation. That's coming up at 5 o'clock. If you are planning to stay but have not registered or checked in for the next session, please do so at the registration table. Also, make sure to check out the Great Northern app to see the full lineup for the Climate Solutions series and the festival as a whole. Thanks again for coming, everybody.